Welcome to Living the Faith, your multimedia Catholic magazine for the coffee table of your mind.
Jessie Romero is our guest today, and he's a retired Los Angeles County Sheriff's Deputy and perhaps one of the few who holds a master's degree in Catholic theology. You probably know Jessie from his radio shows on many Catholic radio stations over the years. He and I were both brothers on the air at Immaculate Heart Radio. A few years ago. And we're going to talk about Satan today, Jessie and I. And I bet as a law enforcement officer, he saw a lot of lives devastated by the demonic. But he was raised a Catholic, and he was raised in the faith after Vatican II. And during this period in church history, Satan has been understated. Maybe even his existence doubted or denied. No more reference, or at least in something other than a symbolic interpretation, to the great angelic war recounted in the Bible itself. I'm fortunate to have been raised Catholic before Vatican II, and Mass, as I knew it, the only Mass there had been for, historians diverge, but at least 500 years. I mean, the traditional, we now call the traditional Latin Mass, goes back a lot farther than that. We pray to Saint Michael, the Archangel, the conqueror of Satan in the great angelic war recounted in the Bible. Several times during the Mass, I forget, 3 or 4 different times during the Mass, and we prayed the prayer to Saint Michael, written by one of the popes many years ago, right after Low Mass, every most common Low Mass. So I'm wondering with Jessie. Jessie, well, first of all, let me say welcome to the show. Welcome, friend.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me.
As a Catholic raised after Vatican II, and I'm not blaming Vatican II for this. I'm just saying that that's how it turned out. When did you start taking Satan seriously?
Here's when I had my red pill moment, when I realized, oh, whoa, there is a person called the devil. This isn't just some medieval superstition or some Hispanic legend that my parents told me to keep me on the straight and narrow. Again, because I was in the 1970s, being a teenager, young adult in the 1980s, I was raised, I'll be honest with you, Ed, I was raised in the Kumbaya, balloons, banners, and butterflies Catholicism, where doctrine wasn't emphasized. What was emphasized was experience.
Yeah, and the doctrine, let me just remind our listeners, the doctrine of the Catholic Church never changes. That's because Christ founded the church. He taught the doctrine to the apostles, and they taught it to the other priests and bishops that they ordained. And bingo, one generation of clergy to the next protected the doctrine of the faith and taught it as well as they could given the circumstances. So anyway, please continue.
They had a pretty good system. It was called the Baltimore Catechism.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
So here's what happened to me. So I joined the LA Sheriff's Department at the age of 20. I go through the academy back in 1982, graduate from the academy in 1983. I'm assigned as my first unit of assignment to the LA County Jail, which is the largest jail in the world. I was working at a section of the jail. It's like a city within a city. It was called the Mentally Ill Offenders Unit. This is where they kept all the serial killers, the mass murderers, the psychopaths, the sociopaths. Most of these guys, they were all in one-man cells. And most of these guys were pre-trial defendants. They were still going to court, fighting their cases. And out of curiosity, I started reading the police reports and the probation reports and the psychological evaluations detailing the gory crimes committed by these guys that were in the mentally ill offenders unit. Some of them were fighting death penalty cases. Some of them were already convicted. They were off to death row. We were just waiting for the Department of Corrections to pick them up. So I remember one day while at work inside the jail, I remembered this Bible verse that jumped out at me the night before at Mass, the second reading at Mass. I remember I had heard the priest, the lector prayed the passage or read the passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 3, which reads, "Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking by the Spirit of God ever says Jesus be cursed, and no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit." So I'm at work and I'm thinking about this verse as I walked up and down the row of cells at the mentally ill offenders unit, doing my cell checks, my security checks. And I observed a lot of these high security inmates. Again, they're in single man cells. As I would be walking, every single day, several times a day, doing my check, I would notice that, these guys are by themselves in a cell. I noticed bizarre behavior. Some of these guys were just like talking to themselves all day long, or talking to somebody, like carrying a conversation. Some of these guys were like constantly in their cells shaking. Some of these guys were howling. Some of these guys were growling and barking. Some of these guys were in yoga positions with their bodies shaped like a pretzel. Some of these guys just would stare at me without moving, and their stare looked like pure evil and rage in their eyes. Their eyes were jet black. There was no pupil or iris. Some of these guys were so erratic and violent that we had to have them tied down on a bed with leather restraints and sedated with medication every few hours. And so as I'm doing my prisoner count on a given day, and I'm thinking about that Bible verse, I walked to this one prisoner cell. He was a serial killer who had murdered an entire family. He was a satanic serial killer. And then and he had all these satanic tattoos, pentagrams, 666 on his body, dragons. So I just kind of, I said, I'm going to ask this guy. I said, are you hungry? He said, yeah, of course, officer. I said, hey, let me tell you something. If you could say Jesus is Lord, I'll go down to the officer's kitchen, because we had special food for us. They fed us like kings. I said, I'll go to the officer's kitchen and I'll bring you back some officers dining, whatever you want. Order what you want.
Jesse, you were naughty.
Yeah, I was breaking sheriff's department policy. And, I knew he'd appreciate the offer because, all he'd been eating for the last 2 years was this generic, bland inmate jail food prepared in bulk. So this death row inmate, he smiled and he said, "Sure thing, deputy." I said, "Okay, here's what I want you to do."
That's all we have time for today. Jesse will be back on our next episode.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Living the Faith, your multimedia Catholic magazine for the coffee table of your mind. Produced and hosted by Ed Horodko. livingthefaith.website. I'm your announcer, Lawrence Vosper.